months ago, when I was walking through a store, I took a detour to the plant section, something I always do, just to see if I can snag any fun plants for a really decent price. And I ran into this travesty of nature. And this has become kind of a popular thing, especially during some of the holiday seasons, which is to take some of these succulents and just give them a coat of spray paint on them into these weird, bizarre colors, probably to entice somebody who doesn't know a lot about plants to kind of get some of these for their nice decorations. But this can be a really big problem for plants, because plants aren't some passive thing. Plants are interacting with both the light coming in for food, as well as they really depend on the gases that get exchanged with the atmosphere. And this spray paint is going to be a really big problem for these plants. And I will implore you to never ever buy these plants if you have a chance. But the reason why this is a problem is because photosynthesis is a form of eating for those plants. And when we think about life, one of the first things we have to ask is, what do you eat? Which in more simple terms is essentially, how do you acquire sugars into your diet so you can do metabolic functions? We have a variety of different ways to do this. First, we have organisms which we term heterotrophs that consume organic molecules. So these are going to be organisms that eat other organisms a lot of the time, or eat decomposing material. But most of life on Earth are composed of autotrophs, and these are going to be organisms that can manufacture their own sugars. They're going to include things like photoautotrophs, like plants, which use the sunlight to make these sugars, or things like chemoautotrophs, which are able to convert inorganic compounds into those sugars. And we see a lot of variety of organisms that do these things. Fungus, for instance, are very much dedicated heterotrophs. They're going to eat a lot of decaying substances, and some of them are actually predatory, such as some recently described fungus that actually are able to eat and lasso nematodes. Chemoautotrophs, such as pipeworms down in ocean vents, are kind of the most famous example of those that can convert inorganic compounds into sugars. But really, heterotrophs come to plants, and even autotrophs come to plants, and even autotrophs, some of them, like carnivorous plants, can kind of blur the line between heterotrophs and autotrophs. This Utricularia here is a common plant that we have even here in Utah that's able to eat small crustaceans in these bladders it has. When we look across that tree of life and organisms that are able to do photosynthesis, there's quite an array of eukaryotes that do this, especially ones kind of associated with the plant phyla on the far side of the eukaryotic tree. And there's a lot of different ways to do photosynthesis. Like we've been talking about chlorophyll B quite a bit, and chlorophyll B is the pigment that's primarily used by plants, whereas these other photosynthetic organisms use other types of pigments. Such as the red algae and the brown algae, they use a lot of carotenoids to gather light. And things like cyanobacteria have special pigments in them, such as bacterial pigment, that is able to capture light for them. And the ability to do photosynthesis is a really important concept. And the reason why we know how important it is almost every branch of the eukarya has some way to take advantage of photosynthesis, even beyond just eating organisms that do photosynthesis. And as you can see in this tree, all those closed circle ones are organisms that do photosynthesis with those plastids. So they actually have specialized cellular components that are able to do photosynthesis. But all the other groups of eukarya have kind of stolen those and incorporated them into the body as symbiotes. And these are the open circles down there. So things like the lichens, for instance, are basically fungus that have captured green algae and keep that green algae to harvest those sugars away from them. Photosynthesis, though, can be broken down into two big basic steps. And this should be seen as just a review from what we've talked about in earlier introductory bio courses. The first step is the light-dependent reactions. And this is where that light's going to come in and it's going to start a chain reaction of electron transport by splitting a water molecule. So this is why O2 is a waste product, because we're cleaving off a hydrogen from H2O and leaving an O2 and an H, and that H is what's going to move an electron chain transport. This transport is going to generate ATP. So we're taking an adenosine diphosphate, adding another phosphate onto it to make it ATP, which is, again, that currency that all cells use. And this process is essentially about taking kinetic energy from the light and converting it into chemical energy, ATP. So that little bit of ATP we make there, though it is energy, it's not enough to power most cells, let alone a large multicellular organism. And so the next part that we see in photosynthesis is what we call the carbon fixation cycle. So we're going to use that little bit of energy that was made during the light-dependent reaction to power a complex series of chemical transformation that's going to take CO2 that comes in from the atmosphere and convert that CO2 into sugar. And so it's important to remember in this setup that plants get their biomass not from the soil or from water, they actually get it from the air, the atmosphere around us, is all biomass in plants are composed of. And if you really look at this process, photosynthesis really depends on essentially 4 ingredients. CO2 that we're going to make those sugars on, water, and sunlight there. And there's not many tattoos I would recommend you get, but there's one tattoo I think that is really important, and that is the photosynthetic process here. Because this is essentially the equation that dictates everything on life. This determines what you and I are eating, and it determines all the plants and all the living things, what's going on. And it's really the key component in taking energy and making it available to living things. The machinery of photosynthesis to do all those complex chemical reactions is rather pretty simple and elegant. First, we have our light capturing pigments. And remember, this light is used to break apart water and start this whole complex process. And plants do this by having pigments that are located in their chloroplast, a type of plastid organelle. And in this, they have structures that are stacked to maximize light coming in and then bouncing off and breaking these H2O molecules. And again, plants are unique that they have very specific chlorophyll to do that. Chlorophyll A, which is kind of common in a lot of eukaryotes, but that special chlorophyll B, and then also they can have lots of other pigments, such as carotenoids and whatnot. And if you look at the spectra that these different pigments make, you can see that the big peaks are in the red area and in the blue light area. And that's why plants are green, because they don't actually absorb a lot of green, they reflect that back. And so to our eyes, it appears like they have that color. The other big important machinery that organisms have that do photosynthesis is that they're going to need to bring in CO2 into their bodies. And CO2 is incredibly abundant in our atmosphere, and it's important for plants, and it's obvious to see how plants evolved in response to lots of CO2. And so what they're going to use is that energy from that hydrogen bonds to essentially take in 3 CO2 molecules to convert it into 1 glucose. And so this kind of basic form of CO2 uptake, we call it C3 because it's 3 CO2 to 1 glucose. And as that CO2 gets fixed and converted into those sugars, it's going to be guided by the enzyme Rubisco, which is a really important enzyme and probably the most abundant enzyme we have on Earth, because every photosynthetic organism essentially needs to use this enzyme in order to convert CO2 to that energy. However, one of the big issues with Rubisco is a very sticky substance. It likes to interact with a lot of different things. In particular, what it likes to interact with is O2, oxygen, what you and I breathe in. And The issue for this in plants is if those CO2 levels drop and they're in a highly oxygenated environment, Rubisco is going to want to grab O2 molecules instead of those CO2 molecules. This happens quite a bit when there's high temperatures, where oxygen is more abundant at higher temperatures. And also if you're opening up your stomata to kind of release water from your body. And so this can be a really big issue for a lot of plants, because once Rubisco grabs onto O2, instead of going through these normal carbon fixation cycles and making sugars, what happens is O2 goes through a process called photorespiration. And photorespiration is a really problematic process because it doesn't make sugars in the end for the plants. In fact, it actually takes more energy to do photorespiration than the plants can produce. And so if a plant is forced to do photorespiration because there's too much oxygen inside of it, it's going to eventually die because it's not going to be able to make sugars. To get around this, plants have some really unique ways to kind of prevent the problems of photorespiration from occurring. The first big mode of photosynthesis to get around this is C4 photosynthesis. And we call this C4 in contrast to C3 is because we're going to use a carbon chain molecule to surround our carbon cycle with enough carbon so we don't have O2 getting in there and kind of screwing everything up. Plants will do this by physically changing their anatomy. And what they'll do is they put the carbon cycle in specialized cells called bundle sheaths, where they're able to keep all the O2 away from that reaction and to physically separate these things. And this also allows the plant to do things like keep their stomata closed longer, which will allow them to conserve more water in a hot environment. And probably one that we all like because everybody likes succulents and cactuses is the chrysalic acid metabolism. And to avoid that photorespiration process, plants that we term CAM plants for it, what they do is they separate these reactions, the light and the dark, during temporal times. So during the day, they're cruising along, breaking water molecules, but instead of throwing the substances from this product to start with that carbon fixation cycle, they convert it into a molecule called malate. And that malate is stored during the day. And then during the night, that malate is then moved in to the carbon cycle where that can be then converted into sugars for storage. This kind of temporal thing takes a lot of room in the plant to do. And CAM plants have specialized cells called palisade cells, which kind of is one of the reasons why we see a lot of succulent plants being succulent, so to speak, so they can take in these kind of dual sunlight, daylight activities. So a quick review is that many organisms use photosynthesis, and not just plants out there. Everything from cyanobacteria, which are prokaryotes, to many different lineages of eukaryotes. And photosynthesis is really a series of chemical reactions, divided in primarily the light and the carbon fixation cycles. And plants really have had a lot of adaptations to get around some of the chemical limitations photosynthesis has. And they do this primarily through C4 photosynthesis and the CAM cycle.